Force Flow Body Cream. Feeling like something small just made a big impression. It is thick and goopy, and I have many questions. Starting, first and foremost, with why is this a Star Wars product? And where can I buy the Grogu sponge? Because as ridiculous as it is, that one is at least mildly adorable. And in accustomed form, I'm now going to move on to answer my own question. See, a lot of people have been commenting on the fact that the Mandalorian and Grogu movie has a strange selection of not particularly Star Wars merchandise attached to it, particularly a whole massive range of no less than 26 separate products on Bath and Body Works. Everything from coin purses to body spray to body cream and cologne. Now, granted, taking weird and miscellaneous merchandise and slapping a logo on it is hardly new. Remember the 40k bathrobes? But this seems particularly disconnected, as if Disney has decided to market The Mandalorian and Grogu to a very strange and new audience, which, in all due likelihood, is exactly what they have. And actually, this makes a great deal of sense, even if it is not going to work, and I am going to tell you why that is the case. Beginning with the reason why this is actually a sensible thing for Disney and Star Wars to do. And it begins with the kind of groundbreaking revelation that companies spend millions of dollars researching and that everybody else already knew about. Namely, that boys and girls are different. Yet again, shocking, I know. But there was actually a massive study conducted into this about 10-12 years ago by Lego. You know, the corporation that makes the funny little colored bricks. They wanted to sell their funny little colored bricks to more people, but their audience was overwhelmingly male. Why was this? After all, they were only selling funny little colored bricks. Surely that should be about as gender neutral as possibly imagined, right? Well, actually, no. The results of this study, to put it rather briefly, was that boys and girls play with things differently. And this preference is apparent even at an extremely young age, where a boy will look at a toy and he will want to play as the toy. If you give him a Batman toy, he will want to know who Batman is, and he will want Batman to behave like Batman in his own imaginary world. He will come up with backstories for the little toys and play with them in a consistent manner. And this didn't have to be anything super complex like Batman with all of his backstory. It could be something so simple as a theme. For example, a pirate ship. If you gave a young boy a pirate ship, he would build a pirate ship, and he would play with the characters as if they were pirates. And in the late 80s and 90s, Lego leaned into this with thematic releases and long series, like Lego Aquazone, or UFO, or indeed Pirates and Castles, where they created entire worlds, settings, universes, and lore behind their toys. This was, of course, an enormous success, and today Lego is a huge company. But girls don't play with toys in that same way. always exceptions to the rule, of course, but in general, if you gave a girl a themed toy, she would largely ignore the theme. She'd happily take the pirates to go shopping, or baking, or living in a city, for example. Even if you gave her a highly thematic toy like Batman, she would, instead of having it be Batman, treat it as any other character in her own universe. In other words, whereas boys would play with toys as they were, and as they were defined, girls more often than not would take a toy and make it her own, in her own world and her own perception of the toy. And that perception turned out, overwhelmingly so, to be, well, girl stuff, like playing house, dolls and family, etc. Which is why, when LEGO started releasing sets focused around that, playing in and around an environment, rather than a specific theme, they finally managed to break into the female market as well. That is not to say that the girls didn't care whatsoever for the theme or the style of the setting, it is simply that they cared a lot less. And what they did care about, they cared about in their own way. They wanted to make it their thing, rather than necessarily accepting it for what it is, with, as usual, the exceptions to the rule. What Star Wars is doing right now, with the Bath and Beyond nonsense, is exactly that. It is taking Star Wars and presenting it in a female fashion. Instead of having Mandalorian and Grogu be what they are, the bounty hunter and his weird little Jedi pet thing, they make them into body wash or foaming hand soap. To put it simply, they feminize Star Wars. And the reason why this is a good idea is because that is actually, again, how that works. If you want to create a product that appeals to women, then you've got to take into consideration that women like different things than men. And Grogu has been Disney Star Wars' by far biggest hit amongst women. Indeed, you could quite easily advance an argument that Grogu has been Disney's, well, not only best, but damn near only successful original character. And explicitly and specifically amongst the female audience, who very quickly embraced Grogu right from the earliest episodes. I remember as well, there was so much bootleg merchandise being produced of Baby Yoda back then, as Disney itself apparently hadn't quite prepared for the success of that character in that way amongst that specific audience. And for a modern, diverse corporation that has always been trying desperately for the last 10 years to appeal to the wider audience, which roughly translates into women and non-white men, this seemed like a huge breakthrough. Perhaps this was finally Star Wars' LEGO moment. And so they've clearly made moves now to hone in on that market, to focus in on it, and to produce a variety of merchandise aimed specifically at the female demographic, whilst also understanding that it isn't asking for the same thing as the male demographic. And this is smart. This is the correct application of the lessons learned by LEGO. Create a product that is not intended to appeal to everybody, because as we have seen quite thoroughly demonstrated repeatedly and ad infinitum for the last 10 years, that product simply doesn't exist. Instead, you craft a product for the target demographic. And a company like Disney was in a perfect position to do just that. With a massive amount of bank and a hugely popular franchise, they could have made a number of series all targeted at different demographics. We could have had our grim, dark Band of Brothers style Clone Wars TV show, or perhaps following a squad of stormtroopers or rebellion soldiers. Whereas we could also simultaneously have had a Grogu-focused series, something cute and dainty for the female audience, or maybe even something focused entirely on female Jedi and their struggles. There's no reason why you can't have both coexist. But the Star Wars problem was that their shows didn't have enough actual Star Wars in them to be appealing to the male audience who, specifically, want their thematic toys. When they want a Star Wars product, they want Star Wars to be the focal point of the product. Nor were their shows aimed specifically enough at the female audience because the shows were usually too action-oriented. Even a show like The Acolyte, which was aimed squarely at the progressive audience, focused too much on fighting and such other nonsense, which alienated the women again. The Mandalorian and Grogu, therefore, is the closest thing that Disney has come to actually hitting that female demographic. The problem is, Disney doesn't have time for that right now. Star Wars has already reached its end point. The Mandalorian and Grogu have apparently flopped completely and utterly at cinemas. And no amount of Bath and Beyond collaboration is going to make up for the hundreds of millions of dollars shortfall in the production budget of an entire movie. And to make things all the more complicated, even if Disney were to learn a lesson from this and craft something specifically aimed at the female audience, the problem is the setting. If you're making Legos, you are just, in essence, making colored bricks. You're not bound by anything. You can make colored bricks in space, you can make colored bricks under the ocean, and you can make colored bricks going to the airport. It's all the same thing, in essence. But when you're making Star Wars, you are making Star Wars. If you make it something silly and feminine, then it'll come across as weird and out of place, and the majority of your audience, which remains and will forever be the men, because it's Star Wars, they won't be interested, they won't come watch, and they won't buy it. Meanwhile, the female audience, no matter how much you appeal to them, whilst they may have a slightly greater interest in a certain thing, they're always going to be turned off by the fact that it is Star Wars. Whilst the underlying theory, therefore, is correct, you should make Mandalorian and Grogu tie-in products like sponges. It doesn't work within the framework that is Star Wars. And whilst you could theoretically make it work by bending and breaking the thematics of Star Wars enough to appeal to a different audience, this would be a massive and painful undertaking. In fact, we have had an example of this recently with Skeleton Crew. If you happen to watch this particular Star Wars show, you will probably have come to the same conclusion that I did, in that it's not Star Wars. This didn't need to take place in the Star Wars universe, and frankly, it has practically nothing to do with Star Wars other than set dressing and props. This is simply a children's story set in the Star Wars universe for no other reason than because, well, Disney owned the IP and they figured it might increase the show's profile. Whereas in reality, it did the exact opposite. You could build up a Skeleton Crew sub-franchise. You could build up a 4 kids Star Wars. In fact, I think Star Wars might be ideally suited for that very thing, but it would require years of building, many shows, and a significant investment that will come at an enormous loss for the first few years, possibly even half a decade or more, until you establish that separate identity. And even then, it's going to be a massive gamble, because when you go against the established grain of a setting, especially one again named Star Wars, about war in the stars, and you try to make it a 4 kids show, you're going to struggle to get an audience. For the exact same reason why the Warhammer Adventures thing never took off. You're going to basically need to build an entirely separate audience for this. And it takes a lot of time, a lot of sacrifice, and a lot of effort. And Star Wars could have done it, and are now trying to, but it's simply far too late. The core audience of Star Wars hasn't gotten what they've been asking for more than 10 years. They're no longer going to support you whilst you try to build a different audience. The men have left the building, and without them, the female franchise will simply never get established. As ironically, you needed the men to stay around to pay the bills until you'd built the other one. It's too little, far too late for Star Wars. But it is the right idea. I don't think Disney is going to learn much from it, however, as, well, we've kept making one erroneous assumption throughout all of this, and that is that Star Wars and Disney at large might want to build multiple fandoms, creating products for their core fans, the overwhelmingly straight white male audience, and then a separate product for other demographics. One for women, one perhaps even for the progressives, though that one's going to need to be produced at a shoestring budget to be able to pay for itself. But Disney always wanted to get all of those audiences by making a single show, which just, again, doesn't bloody work. And at this point, even if they were to create a Star Wars show for the core audience, I'm not sure the core audience would be willing to listen anymore. See, here's the reverse thing as well. Whereas girls play around their toys and create their own histories for it, the boys, they want their toys to be the thing they are supposed to be. And if they are not that thing, they'll simply reject them. That is the position that Disney is in right now. They haven't created Star Wars for so long that those that had been desperately waiting for Star Wars are no longer interested in Star Wars. They're far more interested in seeing it fail, hoping instead that if the entire franchise can simply be burned to the ground through repeated disastrous flops, then mayhaps that will force either a sale to somebody who actually does care, although unlikely considering Disney. They'd probably rather just slam it in the vault somewhere and keep it locked away forever, or that it might encourage some form of a long-term reset, where Disney will lock Star Wars away in the vault until suddenly they remember 10 years into the future that, oh, we had this thing about space wizards and stuff. Okay, well, that's kind of cool, I guess. Let's make a space wizard thing, I suppose. You've pushed the core audience far beyond hope. They've simply entered desperation mode now, and they're hoping that if they reduce your thing to ashes, they'll get a phoenix. This is not an audience that would even necessarily rally around a good product anymore. and might instead simply choose to ignore it, hoping that by doing so, they'll encourage the company to make many good products later. And leaning into a line of bath products isn't going to change their minds. Nor is it going to attract the much wanted female audience in the numbers required to change anything now. But hey, it's still technically a good idea, just not very well timed. And let's be honest, it was probably just by pure accident that they even did this thing right. Oh well. At least I'll get a fancy new sponge out of the death of Star Wars, if nothing else. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.